I'm afraid I haven't got a mask or a stick or any bones to fling at you, but I'll try and do otherwise. Oh, you've got some bones. Great, great, great. Yes, I'm very glad I got to be here. It was a very interesting exercise of wondering whether the strike organisation would manage to hold up all the flights. So on Friday, Saturday and Sunday, all the flights were going to be 12 hours delay, endless queues at the customs offices and what have you. When I actually got to the airport, there was more staff than normal, no queues whatsoever, and it was perfectly straightforward. The flight left on time. So here you have one of the myths of the newspaper: talk up a strike and everything will, you know. So I was kind of interested in that. Bill's right. I just came back from China, so I had this strange trip of teaching 2 days of organisation design program 2 in Shanghai and 2 in Beijing. And then I went to London for my mother's 95th birthday, and then I flew out here. So I'm slightly dotty, that's why. But it is interesting because the thing about organisation design myths, and Bill's right, I work as a consultant. For most of my life, I've been an internal consultant, working in organisations. And then I had a period of which I was employed with them. I worked for British Airways for 4.5 years. I worked for Marks and Spencer, a big retailer, for a few years. I worked for Pricewaterhouse before it was merged with Coopers for 7 years, all internal consulting. And then when I moved to America in 2003, I became an external consultant. So I've seen this consulting from both sides of the fence now. And now I'm back kind of internal consulting with a government agency, which is an incredible experience, because all my previous work has been with large multinationals, essentially. So seeing the design differences there is really, really fascinating on what the legacy of an organisation brings to the possibility of design change, and what for-profit organisation brings to the possibility of design change compared with a non-profit, and then the whole legal and political environments of both. So that whole sphere of where is change possible and where is design kind of feasible is part of this thing that I'm looking at now of myth. Additionally, as Bill said, I've written a couple of books, 3 books on organisations, 2 on design and 1 on culture. And my mother can't imagine how anyone could write 1 book on organisation design, let alone 2 books on organisation design. So if you feel the same about organisation design, you're not alone. And now I'm writing a book on organisational health, which is kind of interesting because I'm learning a lot as I write. So I'm constantly testing myself on this. So this myths of organisation design, in fact, I'm only going to talk about 5 of them, but we can talk about the other 5. And then I thought of another one as I was coming in. But these are the 10, that the main 5 that I think people are kind of most interested in. What I find interesting about design is, first of all, and I'm sure you all know this in the room, people think organisation design is about the structure. That is the organisation chart. So the number of times that someone's rung me up, usually a line manager, although now I'm working, as Bill said, with the head of the agency, most of the time I work with kind of ordinary line managers and HR staff. So heads of business units, heads of smallish departments, teams that are not working together very well, right in there kind of working with them. And for the last month I spent 2 weeks sitting in an office, open plan, because my brief there was to see what's going on, which is kind of a nice brief to have. What is going on? Very small things like, why are people having difficulty with the photocopier? Answer, because the instructions are behind a closed door on the wall. So there's no way of finding out how it works. So those sorts of things are small things which I work with every day. So these myths are built from that very kind of on-the-ground experience of seeing what people ask me to do and then what I try and do to help them think about it differently, usually. So I'm going to talk about this. Don't worry about the Europe thing, because it's illustrative. So if you've never heard of Europe, and a lot of Americans, oh, sorry for the Americans in the room, they think Europe is a town sometimes. Or, you know, is London in Europe? Those sorts of questions. But apologies to Americans in the room, of which I'm kind of one now. So I'm going to look at these things in the 17 minutes, or probably about 12 left. But Bill said I could run over, so that's good. The structure myth, the durability myth, you can read them all, and then look at some assumptions. So the start point that I tend to tell people with is the, and you know this, that an organisation is a system. And what many people don't know, because I often get a line manager ring up and I go into his office and he gives me literally a sheet of paper. And he's been scribbling on it on his journey to work, or she. And they've drawn an org chart, and they say, I want my org chart to look like this. And I say, okay, tell me why you want it to look different. What is the purpose of this exercise? And quite often the purpose is something kind of insane, like I've just got this job and I need to make a difference. Well, okay, that probably will make a difference, but do you know what kind of difference that's going to make? And the notion that something is a system is kind of alien to a lot of people's thinking, that you're thinking about a system. And one of the other things that they find interesting is that there are thousands and thousands of representations of systems. And it doesn't really matter what your representation is. It doesn't matter if you use McKinsey 7S model or the Burke-Litwin model or Jay Galbraith's model or this model here. The point is that it's illustrative of connected parts. So if you move even one part of the organisation chart to a different part of the organisation chart, you're doing something to the whole system. So that's the first thing that I try and explain. And another point for people, if you're not aware of models, line managers, in my experience over years and years, can't bear models unless they're engineers and then they love them. So if you're not working with engineers, don't show a model. It's your own back pocket thing. Because they think if you're going to show them a model, their eyes glaze over and you're one of those rather strange people from human resources who talk in sort of jargon. And the thing about models is this great phrase, I don't know if you know it, all models are wrong, some models are useful. So this model is wrong, but it is potentially useful. The same as all models. So bear that in mind as a thing. The book that I'm currently writing on organisational health picks up the idea that organisations are kind of living. They're not mechanical. So you're not thinking about a car when you think about a system. You're thinking about something that's dynamic. And I don't know if any of you have been following this Occupy Wall Street and Occupy St. Paul's Cathedral and everything. I think that's completely fascinating, because here you've got a whole organisation springing up with systems and processes and job titles and all sorts of things within a couple of weeks. I was stunned to see a letter in The Economist from someone from the Occupy Wall Street camp with a job title of something like media representative. And he'd put that on the letter. It was tremendous fun. So I went down to look at the one in Washington, and all you see is a massive tent. You can't see the organisation behind it. And I thought that was kind of interesting too, that in organisations you can't often see the organisation when you're looking at a chart or a system. So one of the things is, you know, your start point is what isn't there that you should be looking at. The other thing that I think is interesting that, again, managers tend not to think about is that your context shapes the system as much as you are shaping your context organisationally. And that, just to be aware, a lot of systems maps forget the external context. So that the Burke-Litwin one doesn't, but some of them forget that there's an external environment. So if I'm using the McKinsey 7S one with organisations, I make it an 8S model and put in the word surroundings, because the McKinsey one doesn't include surroundings, although some people say and tell me that, well, that's what they mean by strategy, which may be the case. So here's I hope. Yes, good. I was on a journey the other day, on October the 11th, in fact, and I saw this in the Wall Street Journal, and I thought this was incredibly interesting. Look at all these companies. And this was just one day, randomly selected. I happened to be traveling. A Peugeot thing, plans to suspend production at a plant in Slovakia. The company said it would lay off 6,000 workers, mostly in France, part of its bid to cut costs. Dow plans to idle about 4 million tons of production of naphtha. Volvo plans to reduce its truck manufacturing early next year. Scania plans to pare production by up to 15%. Diageo restructures its European operation. Now, the question that I saw as I was just gazing at this photograph is, what is your response to this piece of news, or these several pieces of news? First of all, you can think of yourself as just a reader, and you might just glaze over it. It's just a photo with captions on it. But then if you think, how would you think if you were a line manager in one of those organizations? What would you be actually thinking? Now, if you just take any one of them, what do you think if you're a line manager in Dow, which is reducing 4 million tons of production of naphtha? What does that mean for you and your team? And quite often, line managers know about these changes when they've read them in the paper. They are not doing preparation in changing their organization in order to plan for a reduction of 4 million tons of naphtha or whatever it is. And they're going to have some response. And then the next question is, how would you feel if you were an organization design consultant? What do you expect if you read this in the Wall Street Journal on that Monday when you go into the office? What's your feeling going to be in the organization? Now, as I was thinking about this, and I drive my family completely crazy because I can't go into any shop or fast food place or restaurant or anything without wondering what's going on behind the scenes. So my daughter was really irritated with me the other week when I went into a restaurant and I went up to someone and said, "Are you the supervisor?" And she looked at me and said, "Yes, how did you know?" And I said, "Because I could see what you were doing." Because it's very interesting to know what is going on. How are people organizing themselves? Now, all of these, do you think that they require an organization design piece of work, or any of these? If you were an organization designer, what's your view? Maybe. We don't really know. But it looks as if they might, just on a quick reading of the headline. But when you think about your own organization, and then you think organization design, is it conscious, is it unconscious? Where does it come from? It's quite likely that, and I don't know these organizations particularly, although in China, some of the people in my training course were from Volvo, so I was able to talk to them about it. Quite interesting that you don't necessarily get a lot of notice for all these organization design things. You know, things are happening in the context, and I think this is illustrative that the context, and we all know this as well, is changing all the time. So organizations should be changing all the time. And I think the first myth thus is this, what I call the structure myth. Bill, this is hopeless. Yeah, that's a better approach. I'll walk up to the computer. The structure myth is pretty interesting because if you look at a structure of an organization, and this is a cartoon, and I only just found the attribution. It's by a guy called Manu, M-A-N-U, and it's a Creative Commons thing. But if you look at this, you're looking at something, and the structure chart, the org chart, tells us something about the organization. And in this particular instance, you've got 6 computer or software or IT companies, whatever they are. They're all in the same ballpark, and they've all got different structures, and this is a caricature of the structures. But then I started to talk to people about this. And what is interesting is that the structures start to tell us how work flows in the organization. And one of the things that is a huge difficulty in the work that I do is that people don't make any relation, and this is a generalization, don't make any connection in their heads between the work of the organization and the way it's supposed to flow through the organization chart. So the chart is something that looks like this, but where is the work? But there is a partial relationship, because when you start to unpack these companies, if any of you have worked for them, a company like Apple actually does have these discrete business divisions doing their own things. And the Microsoft is rather aggressive between its business units. So you can start to see that this caricature tells you something about the organization's work. But the first thing to think about is that the work is more important than the structure. Because actually people can work in any structure. And I often ask people, you know, how many times a day do you look at your organization chart to tell you how to do your work? How many times a day do you look at your organization chart to tell you how to do your work? No, they don't tell you how to do your work for the most part. And that's what people think organization design is, about the structure chart. And my private theory is that if Bill Gates put in more options on an organization chart into PowerPoint, there'd be more variations of organization. Because everybody is limited to Bill Gates' view of an org chart that looks like this. It's very interesting of how you kind of think about, why do we all use that one? So the first point about a structure is, first of all, people can work in any structure. It's kind of immaterial because they're trying to do work. And that's now interestingly being revealed on things like organizational network analysis and social network analysis. You can see that the work getting done, and if you're interested, Rob Cross at the University of Virginia is very, very good on organizational network analysis. He shows org charts and organizational work, and they're very, very different. The org chart essentially shows you hierarchy and levels of accountability or authority, or how much money you can spend at what level, or stuff like that. It is true to say that some structures, and I'm talking here about org charts again, are slightly more efficient than others, as you can see on this. So some are better than others at some things. So a matrix is sort of slightly cumbersome, but you can get decisions made quite quickly, or form and reform project teams, or what have you. The other thing that I find really fascinating is, and I had this hilarious discussion with, it wasn't at the time, I have to tell you. I was working for a client, and we got to the end of the design phase, so we have a design, which is an org chart, and where people are going to work, and the relationship between work and the chart, etc. And we had 3 variations, and he said, which one is right? And I said, I don't know. They could all be right, or they could all be wrong. We only know what we know. So he was a kind of big man, tall and hefty. So he glares at me, he said, we're paying you to tell us the right answer. And I just thought that was just so funny. There is no right answer. There isn't a right answer. You are not going to know what structure is right, because you don't know what the other ones are going to be. Because you're not testing the other ones, you're not living the other ones. And then I used to live in San Francisco, and I went to a cafe, and the guys in the cafe wore T-shirts. And on the back of the T-shirt, on all of them, was, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And I thought this was just such a great idea for telling my client, take this fork in the road, you'll be fine. And that's the other myth, that they think generally that a structure is stable, and it's completely unstable, more or less. As soon as someone moves, you've changed the structure. As soon as you get a new person in, even if they're in that designated role, the way they do the work will change stuff. So there isn't a right answer. It's always immobile. So fixating on the organisation chart is not organisation design, in my view. Bill, thank you. I've got to move on.
So you didn't get each other.
See what a team we are. So now we've got the durability myth. This is the sort of development of that. That people are thinking that everything's okay, that the design is going to last. They're paying no attention to what's going on in the environment, so they don't know they're about to have to restructure. And this is a great kind of difficulty, again, that I meet with people, particularly, and sorry to the HR people in the room, to the HR function, is that they don't pay attention to the business world and the outside context. So if I say something like, you know, did you read the Wall Street Journal, or have you read Fast Company, or do you know what is going on? They don't know. And nearly all organisation designs are triggered by external events. Mergers or acquisitions or upsizes or downsizes in relation to something going on in the context. The ones that are triggered by a new leader joining are many fewer than the external context ones. So you need to be predicting the external context all the time. And there are some quite interesting little exercises I do. I'm sure a lot of you know these ones like PESTLE and STEEPLE and EPISTLE, which are all the same thing, about analysing the external environment in a little bit of, not necessarily detail, but just to give you an idea. So the durability myth that it's going to last is completely untrue. It may, and that's the other thing my clients ask, how long will this last? Well, I don't know if there's going to be a financial crisis tomorrow, or the naphtha market is going to expand or contract. It will last as long as it lasts, essentially. The other point to bear in mind, and I get asked this question a tremendous amount, is structure always a start point of a design process? And the answer is no. Generally speaking, structure could be one of several start points. And often, and again, people get terribly distressed because they say, we're starting in the middle. You know, the people, organisation designers get called in after the design has been decided. And then they say, how do we design it? And this where do you begin and what the process is very fascinating and perplexing to people in the field of where's the beginning, middle and end, because they want to see a beginning, middle and end, not a chaotic environment. And again, it is quite chaotic. I'm doing an actual piece of work now, which is a huge design piece of work. It's totally chaotic. And I listened to a webinar by Meg Wheatley last week on perseverance, and she's just written a book on perseverance. Meg Wheatley is an OD kind of writer. The book on perseverance is about, well, obviously persevering, but in all these chaotic circumstances when things look as if they're going to go wrong all the time, well, at a high level view. And that where do you begin and end an organisation design project? A, not necessarily with the structure, and B, sometimes in the middle or sometimes kind of towards the end, which is the beginning, as it were, of the next round. So the second myth is that it's going to be durable. It's definitely not going to be durable. Third myth is predictable. This is the take any fork in the road. And I love this. This is from Scott Adams, one of my favourite people. So this is kind of rather my view of organisational life. You can, you know, because it's kind of illustrative of the world, except when you talk about fractals, which we were just talking about with John would say that, or I'm guessing, some people will say there is some form of predictability in the chaos. And there is predictability in chaos. And so, you know, take this with a little bit of pinch of salt. But generally speaking, this predictability is a myth People want things to be stable, they want to know the right answer, they want to know that it's going to deliver what they wanted it to deliver, and you simply don't know. You're hoping for the best all the time, given your information. Now, you can increase the likelihood of success, and you can do this in various ways. And going back to the three layers of this conference of hierarchy, collaboration and accountability. My work tends to be between hierarchy and collaboration. So you're trying to move people and things and ideas and concepts from a hierarchy, a rigid system, into participation and collaboration. And one way of increasing the likelihood of success is by involving a lot of stakeholders in the design process. And that can cause kind of issues among the higher ups in the organisation. We'll just tell them what to do. That's why I like that jugs and mugs thing that someone said. The other thing is continuously reviewing progress, because people begin down this path and they forget that the context is changing as they're doing it. So they don't review enough. And there's been some spectacularly wonderful things happen, like if anyone of you know the National Health Service, but it happens anywhere, you know, you get into a multi-million-pound IT implementation of patient records. 3 years in, they decide to abort the whole thing. Well, they could have aborted it in year one if they'd been reviewing things and looking at the context and predicting the political landscape, etc., etc., and that happens a lot. Another way is to keep a running risk of logs, and a running log of risks, and that is something that I've learned to do. What are the risks going on all the time? And we had one in my current project, which I raised months and months ago. What are the risks of not getting the funding? And everybody said, we'll get the funding. And I said, but there's still a risk we might not get the funding. We didn't get the funding. You know, we could have been working with that. But that's another interesting thing about being an organisation designer. You don't necessarily have the influence and power and clout in the organisation to actually lob those things where it can go to and be acted on. Have the courage to change direction if you see things are going wrong and they're going to become unpredictable, and do a lot of walkthroughs and tests. And that's what I do a lot in the work that I do, is checking that what's happening, what you're planning is more likely to be successful than less likely. Okay, now for some reason I get asked this question a tremendous amount. What's the relationship between change and design? As if there can't possibly be any connection, which I find staggering, because you can't do any design work without changing stuff. You've automatically got to have changing things. That's what it's about. That's what a design is. It's changing something. And what I think people think is that someone called a change manager in an organisation, a role title, is not an organisation designer. So I think that they're getting at this question is, do we need to put a change manager with the organisation designer? Now, in my current organisation, we've been told not to use the word change and management collectively together. So this is kind of baffling too, because change is a kind of ordinary word. But I do agree with it's very difficult to manage change. So I have a slight agreement on the change manager thing, because you can't really manage change. But what is happening on this is that the notion that they're not connected. And one thing that I've found people kind of find helpful is that you can think about change as something that's going on absolutely all the time. Like anyone in the room, as far as I'm aware of, who has an iPhone, did not get their iPhone as a result of doing some colossal change management project in how to use a new style of phone. They just got a phone. So that is continuous incremental change. There's this sort of intermittent incremental change where change management might be required, like if you're introducing a new performance management system and you have to tell people how it works, unless it's kind of intuitive. Then there's this continuous radical change, which you saw on that Wall Street Journal thing. Those organisations like Volvo and Dow and Diageo are going through total change all the time. And one of the things that's interesting for me, moving from corporate world to government world, is there is continuous change all the time, but it's completely different. It's about personality changes, and power changes, not about financial changes and that sort of thing. A very, very interesting difference on how you think about organisation. And then there's this intermittent radical change, which is where people tend to think about organisation design work. So we're going to have a merger. We need to reduce by 50%. We need to upsize. We need to move into new geography or something like that. But what is the kind of thing to deal with is they're all happening all the time anyway. So you're dealing, as you're doing a piece of organisation design, with all those four kind of interconnected types of change going on all the time. So this is why you have to keep looking at the design work to see if it's going along and managing all the changes associated with it. You can't separate out any of these things. Similarly, you're doing organisation development work, and that's another question I get asked about organisation development. Is it the same or different from organisation design? And I do pick up a kind of metaphor, an analogy for explaining the difference to people. If you think of organisation design as your kind of physical body, so you've got 2 eyes and a nose and hair and fingers and what have you. And you can change aspects of it. And you can manage, if you have a hand amputation, you can still survive. So there are things that can happen in your design. But the development aspect is the food you eat, the amount of exercise that you take, the way you learn things, those sorts of things which are keeping your body essentially healthy. And you can't split off the two, so that the design involves development. And you're developing an existing design, essentially. So the thing about design and development being different is another myth, essentially. It's just, they're parts of the same thing. Then there's the myth about the quick fix. And I quite like this quote too. Because I'm continuously being asked, how long will it take to get to the new design? And apart from saying I don't know, which annoys people intensely, because they want to know, basically they want to know how long is this piece of project work going to take. That's fine. You can say it's going to take about 6 weeks to do an assessment, or depending on the size. I was on a project that took 2 years to do an assessment. I mean, it's a huge project. It wasn't that people were spending their time doing it. But there isn't a quick fix. You cannot change things that quickly. A, because they're unpredictable, and B, because they're changing anyway and you're not quite sure where they're changing. And if one of the examples someone quoted this morning was Cisco. And John Chambers initiated this thing about adjacencies and what have you 6 years ago, and there's still now has come to the conclusion that didn't quite work. He's still trying to change the organisation. An organisation is in constant flux. So what do you think of when are we going to fix it? It's probably never going to happen. You're going to continuously have to keep on refixing, and it won't be across the whole organisation anyway. So they're not fixed or fixable. And I think one of the kind of nutty things is that shareholders want to see something happen. And if you work for, one of the things I enjoy about government is they're not particularly interested in shareholders in that sense, or perhaps even citizens, but I'll forget that one for the moment. But the thing about looking at the ticker tape on the bottom of the TV screen all the time is totally insane. You're never going to be able to get any form of workable thing by trying to respond up to that sort of level of short-termism. If you look at Ford, which is another organisation I've kind of been interested in, and I was talking to some people there, Mullally is now 3 or 4 years into changing Ford, doing it very well. And the people who work there are very impressed with what he's doing. It's 4 years. It's not like 6 months or a month, which people are looking for. So that quick fix myth is very interesting to sort of challenge people on. What do they mean? What does fixed mean? If you want to sort of bust some of those myths, you're trying to think about open systems. Or if you're not tremendously interested in the sort of mechanical systems model, you can sort of think about complexity or chaos or any of these ideas or concepts that make you think of connections. Ask a lot of questions. And one of the things that people I work with, and it was very striking, particularly in China, and when I began teaching organisation design work in the UK amongst HR staff, is the relationship of what they're being asked to do with the people who are asking them to do it. And you need courage to ask questions. And you need courage to challenge someone's idea that the organisation chart should look like this and not like this. And why do we have to spend time on looking at the work when all we have to do is change people's names in the boxes? So that asking lots of questions in an open, non-judgmental, curious way is tremendously important. The challenging assumptions is also incredibly important. What makes you think this new design is going to be better than the old design? What are your indicators of success? What assumptions are you making around the time it will take, the cost of it, the quality that will result at the end of it? So all of those questions around the assumptions that are being made. What makes you assume that these people are going to want to stay with the organisation? What makes you assume that we're going to carry on being able to have a marketplace from 4 million tonnes of naphtha? Those sorts of questions. Looking for the various options and the leverage points and the good entries, this is around looking at, I think, around what's working. Where have we done things that have worked? Where can we do more of that sort of stuff? Where are the points where people are doing interesting things that you can see if they could influence others to do that, or at least tell stories? The options is good, because one of the questions that I ask a lot is, if we didn't do this, what else could we do? If you still want to get to that result, what other ways are there of getting to it? And that is something that people don't ask themselves very much. You know, and you do when you're doing a journey. You know, if I hadn't got to here, I started to talk to Bill about what other ways can I do this presentation. You know, there are always pretty much other ways. Except in some circumstances there aren't, but quite often there are other ways. And doing enough of the right things at the same time, people tend to think of design work as kind of linear and sequential. And it is not linear and sequential. It's, well, apart from chaotic, you're trying to do lots and lots of things simultaneously. And the right things, like the thing that I'm currently involved in, has got, first of all, it involves space changes. So it's got architects, it's got furniture manufacturers, it's got the union, it's got technologists, it's got me, it's got leaders trying to lead their team through all the different